theropods. And I'm so excited about having Dr. Clarke here to talk about it. If you don't know her work, she's from the Jackson School of Geosciences at the University of Texas at Austin. She's published well over 100 articles, including, I think, 14 or more for Nature and Science magazines. Really, really astonishing work. And very recently, she was on NPR's Science Friday. And that's where I first heard about your work. And I was very excited to hear the talk. I listened to it again today. I'm so excited to welcome you, Dr. Clarke.
All right. So just to introduce myself a little bit, I am a field paleontologist. I do field work all over the world, most relevant to this talk in Antarctica. And the other pictures shown here are southern Chile, where I'm also working on high latitude extinction and survivorship around the KPG boundary. So, but I like to point out that scientific discovery, to me, so often we visualize paleontological discovery as like a single moment in the field, and wow, there's a dinosaur right there, and that's the moment of discovery. But in my career, the most exciting discoveries have come not, of course there's an excitement in the field, but from studying or bringing new insight to fossils, amazing fossils that I've been privileged to work on, but from studying living animals and actually gaining new insight, asking new questions of living organisms prompted by questions about the deep past. And that's what this talk today is fundamentally about. And the other thing I always like to put in my talks, especially for any kind of outreach context, is that science is fundamentally a collaborative endeavor that is enabled by diverse and sometimes unusual minds, like by which I mean, I like to tell all of my students that the way they're approaching a problem in a different way is their superpower. The more minds that we can get approaching problems in new ways, the better science that we're going to get. So this is my lab group. So back to the secret lives of dinosaurs. Ever since the first discoveries of extinct dinosaur fossils, we've been bringing them to life. And this is one of the first illustrations of an interaction between humans and dinosaurs and other extinct organisms. But this fascination continues, continued in the media and with broad media attention, and even to kind of subtler aspects of these potential secret lives of dinosaurs. What not only did they look like, but what in fact could have been some of their behaviors. And what I'd like to talk about today is how do we use science to reveal aspects of dinosaur behavior, appearance that we never thought possible, and at the same time show how asking these questions, which can seem quite esoteric perhaps, has illuminated our understanding of living dinosaurs, birds. So just a brief history to get us on the same page. The study or the evidence that birds are one group of dinosaurs is founded on hundreds of years of anatomical observation of primarily fossilizable parts of animals. And the parts of animals that readily fossilize are those that are mineralized. And so we've looked at skeletons like these, and we've tracked the tiny bumps on bones, the tiny features of the skull through time to gain strong evidence that birds are living dinosaurs. And as I like to tell my students, Thanksgiving is really a chance to dissect your dinosaur. So as illustrated in this by another Julia, who's also went to school in the Bay Area, I also take apart my living dinosaurs. So a lot of my work is dissection and is based on trying to fundamentally understand the connection between non-fossilizable or not typically fossilized parts of organisms and the parts that do enter the fossil record. And so that's how we gain these kind of trickier insights into the secret lives of dinosaurs. So first, I'm going to briefly touch on two aspects of dinosaur appearances and how those relate to how we reconstruct their behavior. And I hope you also see in this the connections with living dinosaurs and how both study of living dinosaurs has informed extinct dinosaurs and how they, where the new questions come from. So in these earliest illustrations of extinct dinosaurs, they look very lizard-like. In fact, I think they look a lot like this little dude who is a tuatara. But in fact, these early models that were based on hypotheses about both relationship and behavior are far from the truth. We now have strong evidence that extinct dinosaurs are well nested in a group called Archosauria, with crocodilians as their close cousins, and of course living dinosaurs as birds. The tuatara is the sister taxon to our living lepidosaurs, our living lizards and snakes. And so it's really not particularly closely related. And this matters when we want to reconstruct unfossilizable parts of an animal, or rarely fossilized parts, because relationship tells us what we might reasonably be able to estimate in the ancestor of things like crocs and birds. Well, crocs and birds, as we all know, look quite different from one another. If we have these two models, what might we think about the appearances of extinct dinosaurs? And I think probably everyone at this point is aware of major discoveries made in northeastern China. This is what's shown as a quarry through an ancient lake bed. These lakes were rapidly deepening. They had very fine sediment, but abundant sediment. So organisms that died in them were very rapidly fossilized. And so that led to preservation of these usually rarely fossilized parts. And those led to our first discoveries of filamentous covered dinosaurs and feathered dinosaurs. So this was the first dinosaur with non-scale or skin-like body coverings that was ever discovered in 1996. That was actually the year I started my graduate studies, so it was a particularly interesting time to be studying these things. But since then, we now have abundant examples of dinosaur filaments, fuzz, and bristles. They actually range in scale, a whole variety of scales and lengths, if you will, so diameters and lengths and distributions on the body. As we get closer to basically dinosaurs that were predicted based on the bony evidence to be the closest cousins of birds, those dinosaurs were also discovered with branched pinnate structures. And so those closest cousins, if we look at this on a kind of schematic tree of Dinosauria, we had evidence that birds were nested in one particular theropod part of the dinosaurian family tree, just as we as humans are nested within Mammalia. But after that discovery, based on the bony attributes, we then discovered that body coverings followed the same pattern. The blue dots, which are maybe the key to this, is covered up by the zoom screen, but the blue stars are showing the rough distribution of bristles and single unbranched filaments. And then what you see in these close cousins are an array of taxa before the estimated origin of active flight that are branched and what we would call feathers. So this has changed our notion of what dinosaurs look like. Not only are they feathered, but in even more recent years, we've been able to look at those fossilized feathers when they are rarely preserved and look at evidence of the melanin-containing organelles that are deposited in the feather keratin. And this example, there are other examples that I could give of this, that we have started to put color on extinct dinosaurs. So not only are these close cousins of living birds feather covered, they also share attributes of coloration that are only seen in living birds. And this study I really like to emphasize because it was simultaneously a discovery about living taxa, living birds, and extinct forms. So at the time, we knew that super elongate pigment packages, the geometry relating to the composite melanin chemistry within these structures, that relationship had been known, but these super elongate and skinny melanosomes that covered the body of this extinct dinosaur Microraptor, we actually did the first statistical study to show that that's uniquely associated with the kinds of iridescence that we see in things like phasianids and seriforms, and actually an array of other birds as well. More recently, we actually found another form of iridescence in these branched structures within extinct dinosaurs that led to the first study of melanosome shape in a variety of other birds. And this was one of my favorite dinosaurs, extinct dinosaurs, to work on, a dinosaur we called Saihong Juji. And Saihong means rainbow. And what we found was that unlike the other dinosaurs from this same deposit, there were these imbricated, kind of flattened melanosome structures that were quite distinct and most similar to the size and shape of those seen in hummingbirds. Now, it was well known that hummingbird melanosomes were what is often called hollow. I like to call them Rice Krispie texture. And living hummingbirds produce these very bright iridescent colors in different ways, same type of pigment, melanin pigment, the same pigment that colors our hair, for example. But what it is that it's the geometry of their organization and also the internal geometry of these component melanosomes. So that was known, but the shape and structure of these, we started looking at things like swifts, and we looked at Sophia, if that's a bird that you guys know, Sophia crepitans, and there were these more similarly shaped melanosomes to those seen in hummingbirds, but they weren't hollow or Rice Krispie textured. And I'm going to move this zoom screen again. The pink circle is the distribution of melanosomes in Kaihong Juji's in the parts that had these flattened melanosomes, which were only in the front parts of the animal and one part on the tail. And they're compared to the distribution of hummingbird melanosome shapes, regardless that they're not hollow or Rice Krispie texture, whereas all other birds are shown in gray. Sophia crepitans is shown in blue, and swifts are shown in green. So swifts and Sophia crepitans they're overlapping part of the observed variation in Kaihong Juji, but really it's only hummingbirds that overlap that distribution. And there's been a lot of interesting studies now that have suggested that the shape change precedes the hollowness change in hummingbirds. So we're actually, by doing this kind of work to understand an extinct dinosaur, illuminating and starting to ask new questions about the evolution of feather color within living birds, especially the relationship between geometry and color in these more fossilizable feathers. So all of that said, when we reconstruct this new vision of the extinct dinosaurian cousins of the first things that had airfoils that clearly could have been involved in active flight, that's an awkward statement and I'm happy to talk about it further, but these guys show at least two forms of iridescence. This is a reconstruction of Microraptor, and there have been studies of iridescence in living dinosaurs that have strongly linked them to sexual selection. And I think this is kind of part of what I call the sexual selection revolution in dinosaur studies that was preceded by a large emphasis on bony structures and their function and signaling, to this notion that elongate feathers when they first evolve are involved, clearly show signs that they're involved in visual communication and signaling. So this is kind of my summary of what I think is some of the most fascinating things in the evolution of dinosaur body coverings, which is that we now have filamentous structures in things like pterosaurs. They were called something different, called pycnofibers, but they are similar and they are the same in structure so far as we're able to discern. An array of ornithischian dinosaurs with filaments, a couple of clades like sauropods in which they are not yet known, and then abundant within theropod dinosaurs, which are shown on the right. And what you can see here is that what used to be called protofeathers would be estimated to originate in the Triassic, more than 100 million years before the estimated first origin of flight. So I think it's a misnomer to call all these fuzzy structures we see in dinosaurs and their relatives protofeathers. They're not like intending to become a feather. It's just that in one clade within Theropoda, there was further modification of these filamentous structures and elaboration of the pinnate feather shape. As I like to emphasize, every kind of novel locomotor behavior has to have its first origin, and it's not going to spring fully formed in the form that it has, for example, today. And what we see is in these forms that have pinnate feathers, they're clearly involved in signaling and communication, as shown on the far right, but they are also involved in some kind of aerial locomotion or escape behavior. And so they have kind of dual selective pressures on sexual selection and natural selection that are occurring around this transition. So a lot of people were bummed that dinosaurs had this new look, right? You know, the springing out of our traditional scary notions. In fact, the most recent Jurassic Park movie, you know, continues to refuse to make their dinosaurs filamentous. And it doesn't mean that the whole body of these dinosaurs, as beautiful as I think that may be, was necessarily covered with filamentous body coverings. We do know that they are present in large tyrannosaurids, for example. We don't know that they fully covered the body, or were they in a crest down the back, or were they just on the tail and the upper part of the back, for example. If they're involved in signaling, even though these simpler structures that cannot be colored as complexly, they still would be present. And so our resistance to these I find very strange, because you can still make a fascinating, powerful, scary a creature that has scientifically accurate body coverings. But now I want to move from insights into the importance of visual communication in dinosaur evolution, and how that what we clearly appreciate about living dinosaurs, their colors, their sounds, and the sexual selection behind them, has a deep origin within extinct dinosaurs. And we now have evidence that there are multiple forms of coloring that indicate to us the importance of sexual selection at the same time as flight is making its first origin, and likely preceding that. But I want to move to where my research has really been for the last approximately 7 years. And it's trying to crack a different question, which is, what might extinct dinosaurs sound like? That's one way of putting the question, but another way is to say, what is the deep origin of bird song? And as I got into this question, it really became so many questions. So I'm going to take you on that journey today, but let's start with our dinosaurs of our imagination, contrasting them with what science says about dinosaurs. So if I play this short video clip, just think about the sound and what does this sound like? All right, so that was extremely abbreviated, but I actually want you to notice a couple of things. This large, conventionally body covered, conventional dinosaur is running towards these children, presumably with the intent to eat them, and making a sound. So we're going to come back to the context in which sounds are produced as well. But what does that sound like? If anyone's unmuted, tell me what that sound sounds like. I'll play it again while you tell me. Anyone?
Sounds kind of like a lion.
A lion. It is the #1 answer. And thank you, sound designers that were responsible for this perception of what dinosaurs sounded like. But let's talk a little more in depth about animal sound makers and what we know about to inform extinct dinosaur sound making. Well, first of all, we can listen to the cousins of dinosaurs. These are extant crocodilians. So let's listen to them. Okay, maybe you think that sounds kind of like a roar, like quiet. Maybe you think, I've heard that sound in a Jurassic Park movie, and you have. But I want to tell you that this first sound, the one that's very roar-like, the mouth entirely closed. That is a closed mouth sound that's often accompanied by a visual display. Both of these sounds are made with the mouth completely closed. Actually, producing sound with the mouth completely closed is not a particularly rare strategy in living birds. It is rare to not present, it's very rarely present in things like songbirds, but it's quite common in other lineages, more basally divergent lineages within living birds. So there's a whole variety of sounds. For example, here is an ostrich sound. These are not all, of course, not all calls in ostriches are closed mouth, but sexually selected male calls are. So that low frequency woo woo sound is the sound produced. And it's actually something that I meet a lot of ornithologists that haven't realized the most awesome fact about living dinosaurs and our birds is that in reptiles generally, especially those that are macrocarnivores, the esophagus is fully distensible. So in fact, what are commonly called in textbooks air sacs are not in nearly all of the taxa shown and all of the ones down at the bottom there. Those are not specialized air sacs. That is the inflated esophagus. So the bird is essentially inhaling, filling up the esophagus with air. You can see the radiograph of a dove, and then closing the mouth and producing sound in its vocal organ that I'll talk about in a second. So if we want to think about extinct dinosaur sound making, we have crocodilians in which all of the sounds are produced with the closed mouth. And we have a lot of basal birds that produce sounds, particular sounds, with the mouth closed. And so we tried to estimate what would we expect in extinct dinosaurs. And we got about a 50-50 chance that extinct dinosaurs were using closed mouth vocal behaviors at least some of the time. But then we did a study of living birds and we looked at correlates of using closed mouth vocal behavior. And in fact, one of those correlates is larger body size. So the species that tend to evolve closed mouth vocal behavior are not our songbirds, but larger bodied birds in general, with predominant, like key examples within the Paleognathi, for example, ostriches and cassowaries and emus. So they don't produce exclusively closed mouth sounds, but they do produce sexually selected closed mouth sounds. So when we bring this to thinking about extinct dinosaur sound making, what I'd like you to think is that we need to reconstruct a variety of sounds, and we need to be thinking about the importance of closed mouth vocal behavior, especially in sexually selected contexts, not contexts for like contact calls, for example, but we still have more research to do in this area. So I'll tell you another way we're approaching this question. So let's talk about how sound in living dinosaurs is produced and talk about sound makers. And we'll contrast what is in the kind of video or movie image of a dinosaur with what we know.
I give you the resonating chamber of a velociraptor. Listen to this.
Well, I'm going to stop it there. He's very thrilled by this thing, but I hope you recognize that those in this movie they actually used the sound of extant crocodilians in the so-called resonating chamber of Velociraptor. Well, I use a lot of CT scan data in my business, but what we're getting wrong in this picture, we need to break it down a little bit and talk about sound makers. So in living crocodilians, the sound vocal folds and the sound producing vocal folds are located in the larynx. That's on the end of the airway. That is in fact the case in us. And what you'll see in the spinning crocodilian head state, you're going to see the bones of the tongue, and on top of them are the tiny muscles that attach to the vocal folds at the end of the airway. In living birds, just showing you an example of a non-passerine bird here on the right, you can see that the sound is produced deep in the chest. It's in fact produced right next to the heart in the syrinx. And this name is really quite interesting if you want to talk more about where the name syrinx actually came from. but it was a name given to what used to be called the lower larynx. It was a distinct set of sound-producing vocal folds at the juncture of the airway or trachea to the bronchi or the branches to the lungs. If we look at living tetrapods, and this is when I got super fascinated with also kind of a sociology of science thing, how have we not worked more on this in a comparative frame? All of these taxa, these species I'm showing, vocalize with a larynx, with the exception of birds. So from whales to frogs, to primates like us, turtles, geckos, all are using the larynx, which is incredibly adaptable. It's actually also functioning in bat echolocation calls and in these super high frequency calls in mice and other mammals. So with that kind of flexibility, why would a new vocal organ unique to birds arise within dinosaurs? So crocodilians don't have it, they use the larynx. So sometime after the split of crocodilians, this syrinx that is the sound and song producing organ in living birds must have arisen. Well, what could we study? That was my question. What could we look at to get at these patterns and trends? So when I started this work, basically the only study of dinosaur sound making, extinct dinosaur sound making, is this kind of much reproduced study of resonating cavities in the skull of one particular group of dinosaurs. Well, in fact, there's no equivalent structure known in any living dinosaurs or any birds, and these dinosaurs are not particularly closely related to living birds. They're actually quite distantly related. So this doesn't really inform thinking about the evolution of sound making in dinosaurs very much. What I want you to remember, though, too, is that when he said the resonating chamber of a velociraptor, it produced sound. But the sound producer is either the syrinx or the larynx, not a resonating chamber, which simply shapes the frequencies of sound after they are produced. So one observation that was kind of key in my early research on this is that I had studied the fossils of many relatives of living species of birds. For example, stem rollers, and there's a moa there, an ostrich fossil, and others. And I would commonly see these mineralized tracheal rings. These are rings that support the trachea and the bronchi in living birds. But I had looked and looked, and I had never seen these structures in a part of dinosaurs that was not related to any of the species we have today, aves. So I think because, in fact, I was thinking about this question and how to approach it, that I actually recognized the earliest known fossilized syrinx within Dinosauria, because I had asked that question. So what's shown on here is the fossilized syrinx in the middle and the tracheobronchial juncture of a crocodilian and a female duck. And I want to tell you about this story. So I basically in grad school had been asked to work on a fossil from Antarctica, and I'd never been there at that time. And we recognized this fossil based on osteological evidence as related to living ducks and geese, so part of Anatidae. Subsequently, I was asked to work on a second fossil that I identified as, and it was in that fossil that had been with me actually for a couple years at least. I was looking at the CT scans, and I saw a tiny piece of bone that I could not identify, but this fossil was very fully prepared. That means the bones were very exposed. So I was just being, I guess, a little bit like over the top with trying to identify this tiny piece of bone. I looked into the CT data, and right in the position where a syrinx is present in living birds, at the top of the chest cavity, was an intact, three-dimensionally preserved rings that support the vocal folds of the syrinx in living birds, which was just mind-blowing. But as I said, this discovery didn't happen in the field, and this discovery was influenced by asking questions that were kind of crazy. Could we figure out the sounds of extinct dinosaurs? So the structure, the actual support mechanism for the vocal folds that produce sound was three-dimensionally preserved. So what you're seeing on the left is unreconstructed. We repositioned a couple of rings there. You can see them. That is the only amount of reconstruction in the syrinx. And there was a whole set of new questions here. Here was a fundamental data type. We had this three-dimensionally preserved support structure for the syrinx, but we didn't have anything to compare it to. Because the syrinx had been studied in many different groups of birds for taxonomic reasons to kind of identify which birds were related to other birds, but these were the illustrations that we had. They weren't three-dimensional. They didn't show us the shape of the pecilus, the different things that support the membranes. They were schematics, and they were often of the outside of the syrinx. They were used in these for these kind of systematic ways to kind of group different birds together. Another major barrier to this work was that almost all the work on vocalization in birds had been done on a model species, the zebrafinch. And they're, as you guys all know, well nested within Aussian songbirds and not particularly relevant to figuring out the ancestral condition. In fact, if you look at most textbook descriptions, if not all of them, they will show you a songbird syrinx. They're not going to show you a chicken syrinx, which would be much closer to what we need to study the earliest form of a vocal organ in living birds. So we had to generate a whole new data set to basically start CT scanning living birds, to look at syrinx structure in 3 dimensions, to look at the geometry of the support structures and how they relate to the vocal folds that produce sound and to the muscles that in some taxa attach to those vocal folds. So we had to do that to just make sense of these new data in the fossil. And this was the first study of its kind. In fact, this was the first description of what aspects of a syrinx would be ancestral to all syrinxes. And what we found was that the structure in the fossil is more complex than what we see in the Palignates as a sister of all other birds. And what we see is that we could estimate these kind of earliest shifts in the vocal organ within living birds. So I like to mention that the syrinx, which was about 67 million years old, from the age of dinosaurs before the extinction event, is still consistent with being from a relative of living ducks and geese. So it's not the Model T of syrinxes. I like to say maybe it's the Chevy Impala. It's the muscle car. Ducks actually have an amazing diversity in syrinx morphology and a lot of unique traits. One is the asymmetry in the left and the right side, which is super pronounced in male ducks, and is also seen in female ducks, but to a much lesser extent. That trait is something we're still studying now. So this fossil doesn't directly tell us about the earliest known syrinx, but what it does tell us about is that it prompted this broader study of living birds that allowed us to, for the first time, have a definition of a syrinx, which was based on structures we could recognize in the fossil record rather than a syrinx produces sound, which was how it was defined. So summarizing kind of what are we finding out about the evolution of sound making, I think we really illuminated brought attention to the fact that we should consider both closed and open mouth sound likely. We also still have not found an earlier fossil of the syrinx within Dinosauria. That structure is likely cartilaginous with a low fossilization potential. It's cartilaginous, for example, in crocodilians. So we still, that tracheal support structure is there, but what we see in living birds is almost always well mineralized. And that is likely uniquely associated with having a syrinx, supporting the airway after where sound is produced. So this is what we're kind of working on now. We've been working on this question of why would a syrinx evolve, which is a truly fascinating question. Originally, we supported the idea that some kind of shift in dinosaurs rendered the larynx not available as a sound source, and so the syrinx would evolve, and it evolved in this new position. But more recently, I personally favor this concept of potential functional redundancy, where in living birds, the larynx does not produce sound. It simply gates the upper part of the trachea. But there could have been an intermediate condition where these two sound sources were present. What's really interesting from an evolutionary biology perspective is that the syrinx is a new structure without a new function. There's clearly, the larynx is an incredibly adaptable valve to vocalization. If it can produce, with all of the other modifications, human language, why would birds evolve something truly unique relative to other tetrapods? And this is something that we have a new paper that we're working on now. We had an earlier one kind of reviewing what this teaches us about biological innovation. So let's get back to dinosaurs and birdsong. So birdsong is a complex phenotype that actually involves, of course, multiple parts of a bird. You have the brain. In songbirds, you have unique areas of control that are involved in vocal learning, for example. Area X on this diagram is one of them. You have the periphery, which I study, which is the syrinx or the vocal organ, but you also have to have innovations in respiration and active breathing. So when we look at dinosaurs, we have to think about the evolution, extinct dinosaurs, we have to think about the evolution of all of these systems. And what do we know about them? Well, in most extinct dinosaurs, the brain is extremely small and much more similar to that of a crocodilian than what we see in living birds. When we get close to the origin of flight, I'm going to move this zoom thing again. When you get closer to the origin of flight, you have a more avian-shaped brain. At the top is one of these close cousins of volant dinosaurs. And on the left is the closest known sister of all living birds. And on the right, we have a representative extant bird. And I believe it may be a crow, but I can't remember. So in the green, we have the forebrain, we have the midbrain, which is now reorganized and stacked under the forebrain, and then the back or the hindbrain in blue in the two Balanoff images. You can see the midbrain in the Torres image is in its what we call primitive or ancestral position behind the forebrain, even in this closest sister of living species. So we published a paper, this is why Matthew heard me on NPR, looking at the insight from this new fossil into the evolution of brain structure in living birds and its potential links with signaling something about survivors versus dinosaurs that go extinct 66 million years ago. We actually also evaluated another hypothesis concerning body size and that extinction event. But I've got this complex picture here. What do I want you to see? In living birds, the midbrain in pink is always stacked underneath the forebrain. The forebrain is incredibly expanded. It's very large. But you can see that in even things, that's the Archaeopteryx brain, which is much more similar to what we discovered in this closest sister to living birds. So when I say closest sister, I mean it's placed as the closest relative of the living bird radiation, but it went extinct 66 million years ago, and living birds and their relatives clearly survived. And what we find is that we have this plesiomorphic position. You can see why it's called the midbrain, is that in outgroup reptiles and basal tetrapods, you have the midbrain in pink between the forebrain and the hindbrain. And in birds, it's actually shifted and flexed underneath the forebrain, this much expanded forebrain. So that means that these shifts in the brain structure, these particular shifts, are seen after the origin of flight and likely maybe unique to living birds. there is some other kind of complexifying story in Oviraptorosaurs that we can talk about if you like. But what I like to tell kids is that what this means is that you're not going to see, we know in living birds that vocal production learning is limited to a subset of all living species. It's likely not ancestral. Your extinct dinosaur could not say Polly wants a cracker. In terms of the complexity of vocal communication, we can't speak to that exactly because there's a greater variety of crocodilian vocalizations that are used in a whole set of contexts, as I'll talk about now. So let's talk about context. So in movies, dinosaurs are frequently vocalizing right before they consume someone. And if you've ever tried to exhale fully and then eat a cheeseburger, it's not a great idea. So that's the first unreasonable context. But in this one, they're interacting with this gentleman in the middle, and they're supposed to be interacting in a semi-aggressive way. Maybe that's more consistent, but we don't have any evidence to inform that from living animals. But we do know that the most important contexts that are shared between between living crocodilians and living dinosaurs or birds is the communication between juveniles and adults. And this is present in both crocodilians and in precocial extant birds. You see sound being produced before the babies are even hatched. And that is not seen in other reptiles. So that's another trait that we didn't predict to be true that is in fact characteristic of only this group of reptiles that includes birds and crocodilians among living organisms. Another shared context for vocalization between crocodilians and birds is in sexually selected contexts. So either male-male territorial display or in attraction or functioning in communication for sexual selection, what's commonly called like mate attraction. So I like to say if we re-envision Jurassic Park today, it might be a rom-com, and certainly all of the organisms would sound very different. I hope I've taken you today beyond this conventional image that persists somehow with like Ray Harryhausen-like images of dinosaurs in our movies to a vision that really is inclusive, that emphasizes that seeing birds as living dinosaurs actually both adds to their appreciation, but I also like by emphasizing aspects of evolution of the brain to say, well, we are surrounded by organisms, the intelligence of which we underestimated for many, many years. The science of avian cognition, the science of avian sound making is far behind that of mammals. And so we're only beginning to discover more about the complex stories these living dinosaurs have to tell us. And so with that, I'd like to say thank you. And I hope I haven't gone over time because I realize I do not have a timekeeping device, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, why don't you turn your, stop sharing so we can see your face a little bit better.
Now I can see my time and I'm okay. So...
You're just fine. That was wonderful, remarkable, and perfect timing. So.